Welcome to A Drop of Silence, the groundbreaking podcast series that dives deep into the realms of controversy. Join us as we bring special guests who share their extraordinary experiences and offer unparalleled insight into history, today's news headlines, and the future. Get ready to embark on a thought-provoking journey where silence speaks volumes and the truth lies somewhere beneath the surface.
What time will it be when war is no more? When bullets are melted and the warships moor?
Everybody nowadays thinks that the situation we're in is totally unique, like all of the racism and the hatred and the wars and everything. And everybody's going, oh, we're doomed, it's the end of days. But if you're an avid reader like I am, you go back over the centuries and you realize, yeah, not so much. We're still exactly the same as we were in Shakespeare's days. And he's probably the biggest writer or author to look at, to examine what he was experiencing in his days, to see how society has evolved. And you find out we haven't evolved all that much. But one of the biggest pros or professionals of understanding this part of Shakespeare is a man named David Prosser, a lovely Scotsman who worked at Stratford in Ontario, the Stratford Festival. And he did all of their writing and explaining all of these issues. But afterwards, when he retired, he continued as a speaker. And when I had my writers' conference, the Windsor International Writers' Conference, the first person that I invited to come and speak was David Prosser, and about how Shakespeare, even though he was from the 15 and 1600s, is just as relevant today as he was back then, because things really haven't changed all that much. So have a listen to what David says.
Shalom, everybody, and welcome to A Drop of Silence. I'm Pam Goldstein, your host of this podcast series. With me today is somebody that I have admired for years, and I believe it or not, I'm thinking back to the first time I saw you speak at Stratford. That was like over 20 years ago. Like, oh my God, just like that's so bad. But David was born in Aberdeen, Scotland, and then you came to Canada to finish your education, and eventually you joined the staff of the Stratford Festival, which is where I know you from, where you did most of the writing and editing for their publications. But they've used you to talk about Shakespeare and all of those intricacies that are involved with Shakespeare. And when I ran the Windsor International Writers conference, I had you come down and speak specifically about that. So welcome, David, to Drop of Silence.
Thank you.
And A Drop of Silence, as I explained to you, talks about the importance of people standing up for other people's rights and for noticing and recognizing when people are being oppressed and everything. And to me, writing is like so key in getting people's attention to situations. And Shakespeare, God bless him, he was really good at that. And can you give me a little bit of insight onto Shakespeare and some of his work that brought things to light?
Well, of course, one of the things about Shakespeare is that he is a bit of a mystery. We don't know much about him, really. We know more than we do about some of his contemporaries. But it's the details of the life, for instance, are pretty sketchy. And of course, that void has often been filled by speculation. It's also very hard to figure out from the works, and the works are all we have, where Shakespeare stood on the issues of the day, if he took a position or not. I personally just think of him as a working playwright who just happened to be a spectacularly good one, with an amazing flair for language, obviously, and an almost, I would say, unparalleled capacity for seeing into the human heart, the human psyche. So yes, there are plays that Shakespeare wrote that deal with subjects or that present situations or characters that today we recognize as being tied to issues that concern us today. Always hard to figure out how concerning those issues were in Shakespeare's day, because whatever you do, you can try to recreate an Elizabethan performance from everything we know about the Elizabethan theatre. We can have boys playing the women's parts, we can have the costumes, we can have it in the open air, la la la. What you can't do is create the sensibility in the audience of an Elizabethan audience. We just can't. I mean, to take an obvious example that I think pertains to much of what we'll talk about today, you cannot today present The Merchant of Venice and have it have the same effect it would have had on an Elizabethan audience, because we had the Holocaust and they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
The knowledge of the Holocaust, the knowledge of what happened in the last century, completely colors and affects any way we see that play. How it came across in Shakespeare's day, what Shakespeare intended in writing it, those are tricky questions to answer. I mean, one can theorize, which I'm happy to do if I can, but
Yes, please do.
well, I mean, I don't think there were a lot of Jewish people in Shakespeare's England. They had actually been banned by Edward I in the latter part of the 13th century. But some stayed and some trickled back in, and then around the 1590s, was it? No, sorry, I beg your pardon, the 1650s. By about the 1650s, they were kind of officially allowed back in. Even so, there may not have been a lot of Jewish people in Shakespeare's London, but there would have been some, and it's quite conceivable Shakespeare had some, encounters or dealings even with those people. What I think you have to take into account, we tend to think of things like racism and intolerance and anti-Semitism as being active viewpoints, active mindsets, deliberately chosen mindsets. And of course, for out and out racists, that's the case. But I think for a lot of people, they don't think about it, right? There is a kind of lexicon of words and ideas that you kind of just pick up without thinking. And I'll give you an example. Two examples actually. When I was a kid and a young teenager, there was a phenomenally popular variety show on British television. Basically a show, a series of songs and dances, and it was Stephen Foster's songs, it was show tunes like 76 Trombones, it was, songs that everyone knew and loved. But these were performed by a company made up of white showgirls with sequins and all the rest of it and feathers, and white guys in blackface. And I mean, that sounds appalling today. In those days, and we're talking not that long ago, within my, lifetime, nobody thought about it. At least nobody white thought about it. What black people thought about it is another question. But the point it was, and don't get me wrong on this, but it was in a sense wholly innocent. It wasn't intended to be racist. It was tapping into a tradition, and the thing was wildly popular. I mean, of course, now people look at that and they kind of cringe with horror. But my point is that it was a kind of not deliberate, unthinking use of a kind of, I don't want to use the word tradition, but there was a tradition and it was kind of stereotypical, but it was just using it. Oh, that's an interesting idea. The other example from my own life was many years ago now. I got quite a shock. I went into a shop and the lady served me, and then we realized she'd given me too little change. And she said, oh, and said so in a very friendly and pleasant manner. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to Jew you.
Yeah.
And I just kind of went, I'd never had anyone say that in my presence before, and I was too stunned to actually say anything. I just took my change and went. But I mean, again, that woman didn't actually mean to be hurtful. She just didn't realize, in a sense, what she was saying. So even in Shakespeare, you will get a couple of occurrences at least two that I am aware of that kind of thing. And, I'm not Jewish, but as looking outside, the thing in Shakespeare that makes me most uncomfortable on behalf of Jewish people is a throwaway line in Much Ado About Nothing, where you have Benedict, who is, the hero basically of Much Ado. He's like the person we're all rooting for. And in the famous gulling scene, he's persuaded that Beatrice is in love with him, and he says, I must go and he says, if I do not take pity on her, I am a villain. If I do not love her, I am a Jew. I mean, that line gets cut nowadays, but it's not, it's a throwaway with no intent, with no thought behind it, except using a kind of phrase, a stock phrase. I suppose it's a bit like saying, if that's true, I'm a Dutchman, which people used to say, I don't know if they still do. So I don't think there was any intent, but the fact that Shakespeare used it, to me, is a sense that was an instance where Shakespeare wasn't thinking about the implications of that, and for the purposes of that scene, didn't need to think about it. Now, what happens when Shakespeare does think about it? So in 1590 or thereabouts, Shakespeare's sort of pal, I guess, and rival, Christopher Marlowe, wrote a play called The Famous Tragedy of the Rich Jew of Malta. And in that play, Marlowe presents a Jewish character who is unredeemably evil. Like Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, he has a daughter called Abigail. But unlike Shylock, and Abigail has a Christian lover, as Jessica does in Merchant. Unlike Shylock, though, Barabbas, the title character of the Jew of Malta, poisons the lover. The daughter runs off to a nunnery. Barabbas then poisons the nuns' well, I think it is, and kills them all, including his daughter. He strangles a friar for good measure, bumps off a few other people before actually falling victim to a trap that he himself has set, very nasty fate involving a cauldron of boiling water. So, I mean, Marlowe wrote this play, which I don't think anyone could really, well, I mean, I guess one can try to find a way in which Marlowe was kind of satirizing anti-Semitism. But Marlowe basically reached for a stereotype, I think, and portrayed that. And then a few years later, Shakespeare writes a play about a wealthy Jew with a daughter who falls in love with a Christian. And he takes that same idea, but whether deliberately or just in spite of himself, he starts to ask in a way that I don't think Marlowe does, what makes this guy tick? And we get, we're in a romantic comedy, supposedly, in which, you're kind of supposed to root for the pretty young woman and the guy who wants to marry her, right? They're our heroes. And then you've got the guy who's kind of trying to create mayhem, which in this case is Shylock. But Shakespeare goes out of his way to point out the way that those supposedly likable Christian young people treat someone like Shylock. And there's a speech about, when Bassanio tries to, when Antonio tries to borrow money from Shylock, and Shylock says, oh, you want to borrow money from me? Well, let's see. Now you spat at me on the street the other day. You kick me with your foot. Now and you begin to get this picture of the person who has been subject to long-term abuse, disdain, discrimination. He's been ill-treated by the Christians. And then you also, of course, find that there are other unsavory aspects to somebody like Portia in the play, because she has all these suitors from different countries and different ethnicities, and she makes fun of them all. And one of the first ones we see, the first one we see is the Prince of Morocco, who is black, and he fails the test. We all know merchant, you choose from the 3 caskets, and he picks the wrong casket. And she says, when he leaves, she says, may all of his complexion choose me so. In other words, thank God I didn't have to marry a black man.
Yeah.
And there are just little things like that all the way through the play. And there is actual overt hatred towards Shylock from somebody like Gratiano in the play. So, Shakespeare is showing us these characters who are contributing to the climate in which Shylock acts the way he does. And of course, there's the famous, do I not bleed speech? If you prick us, do we not bleed? And so on. So, what I'm trying to say in this very long-winded way is that when Shakespeare gets interested in a character, he delves into that character and almost can't help himself from finding the humanity. You say, okay, here's this guy, this is what he has to do. Because, let's bear in mind that Shakespeare didn't invent the whole pound of flesh thing. I mean, he took that over from previous literary sources that in turn drew from ancient folk tales. So, I mean, the idea of the Jewish moneylender or merchant or whatever wanting the pound of flesh, that Shakespeare didn't make that up. But he's going to tell that story for whatever reason. And as he does it, he kind of says, well, okay, so why would a guy do that? And you get this rich, rounded character. And you get, there are people who will disagree about this, but to my mind, you get profound sympathy for that character. Yes, he's got his priorities wrong. And yes, he seeks a revenge that is in many ways, that is grossly inappropriate, excessive, out of proportion to the slights. But how do you weigh that? He's had a lifetime of abuse. He's going to make them pay for that with one moment of incredible brutality. So which is worse? I don't know. That's an equation that haunts us still. And so you sort of have this person who is acting in a certain way, and Shakespeare is making that person in many ways seem worthy of our sympathy, particularly at the end, when he is stripped of all his wealth, basically, and forced to convert to Christianity. And a lot of this depends on the staging, but I think most productions nowadays make that forced conversion thing a pretty heavy moment in the play, often accompanied by, again, overt anti-Semitism on the part of the less appealing characters like Gratiano, I've seen, physical kind of assault and, tearing off skull, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that what you get here is the ability to imaginatively enter into someone else's reality.
Mhm.
That's the thing. That is the ultimate weapon against prejudice, intolerance, hatred, because you hate the thing that you fear, and you fear something because it seems incomprehensible to you. It seems alien, it seems monstrous. You enter into that person's mind, and you may not sympathize with their actions, but you begin to understand them. And you can do that even with the worst of characters. I mean, look at the protagonist of the Scottish play, which people in the theater use
Yes.
instead of
Whose name we
inviting
shall not speak.
Macbeth. So I mean, Macbeth is like a murderer, as Kenneth Tynan said, the famous theater critic. He starts the play as a thug and ends the play as a cornered thug. But I think that's a bit unfair, because Shakespeare takes us into the mind
Yeah.
of a murderer who becomes a serial killer, basically. And you don't sympathize, obviously, with what he does, but you feel the torment, you feel the angst inside. And so I think that's Shakespeare's great contribution to making a better world, if you like, is fighting us and enabling us, maybe even forcing us to see what the world looks like through the eyes of somebody who's different from us.
Yeah.
It was a long answer to your question.
Yeah, but it was a good one. It was a good one. The one that always got me was in The Tempest, because you were, I mean, basically the world was it still is in a caste system. And he approaches that through the character of Ariel, where he keeps saying, "Am I free now?" to Prospero. And it's not until towards the end that Prospero realizes what he had done to Ariel. And there's also Caliban in that one. And you had some great insight about that one. I remember listening to that speech you gave about Prospero.
Oops, I should have looked that speech up. I don't what I would have
That
said.
was when that was the first time that there was a retirement.
Well, I have no idea what I said on that occasion. Let me see what I think about it on this occasion. I mean, the very interesting what you've said. I mean, in a sense, I guess it's true that both Ariel and Caliban are slaves to Prospero. Prospero is the white colonizer against his will. I mean, he didn't set out to be. He was kind of marooned on this island, but he has very quickly established dominion over it. And yes, Ariel serves him and Caliban serves him. They aren't very different, of course. I mean, with Ariel, Prospero has rescued, in a sense, Ariel from bewitchment. I mean, Ariel was imprisoned in the cleft trunk of an oak tree, and Prospero used his magic to get him out. And in return, Ariel has to do his bidding for a certain amount of time. And there is a deal, there's a contract. If Ariel accomplishes everything that Prospero wants in the course of that play, he will get his freedom.
Yeah.
And Prospero is not the most benevolent of employers. He Ariel kind of whinges a bit, and Prospero is very quick to say, oh yeah, you want to go back into the tree? No, it's okay. I'll do what you want. I'll do what you want. But he does free him, and there are moments of tenderness between them, which is interesting. Caliban and Ariel, of course, is a kind of ethereal slave. He or she, can be played either way, really, is a spirit. Caliban, of course, is also a slave to Prospero, but of a corporeal sort. And he's the indigenous inhabitant of the island, seems to be the only one. And certainly from the point of view of the other characters, and usually in stage, oh, well, no, I won't say usually, but often in stage representations, he's not entirely human. He's described as being kind of half fish, half man, and but that may be a perception on the part of the Europeans who show up in what is essentially, I suppose, the Bermudas. And Caliban is, there's no contract. He's just there to be exploited, and Prospero does exploit him, and Caliban is very angry about it. Far less submissive in a way than Ariel. I mean, he grumbles, and in fact, we're told that at one point he has attempted to rape Miranda, Prospero's daughter. But then the weird thing, again, Shakespeare does this strange thing. I mean, Caliban is, he's a bit brutish. He may not be entirely human. He's maybe not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and yet Shakespeare gives him that at least one beautiful passage in the play where, Caliban falls under the influence of these two idiots, basically, the Stefano and Trinculo, who are, the lowest of the low in many ways, and they hear noises, and Caliban says, "Be not afeared. The isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight." And it goes on like that for a few lines more, and it's lovely. It's beautiful poetry. It's beautiful language, and it's very poignant. So again, whether actively, consciously, or just because he was the kind of guy who couldn't help doing otherwise, Shakespeare gives this supposedly monstrous creature this moment of beauty, and I beyond that too, I'm also interested in the sort of non-realistic aspects of that. Well, of course, it's all non-realistic. It's a play where magic happens. That's not real. What I mean is that yes, they're, in a sense, Ariel and Caliban are kind of part of a caste system. Yes, they are. They're in the sense that they're outside of Prospero. However, I mean, in this very complex and, elusive and sometimes, I guess, symbolic play, it's also quite tempting to see them as manifestations of Prospero himself. It's often, at least I believe it's often been suggested that, Ariel was in some sense Prospero's imagination. I mean, Prospero can work magic. He has to work it through Ariel, but, when he doesn't need his magic anymore, that's when he lets Ariel free. It's kind of the spirit of his creative imagination, if you like. And also at the end of the play, when everything is sorted out, and people are saying, "Oh yeah, well, I'm your brother. Yeah, oh, I forgive you." Yeah. And at one point, there's a line that always haunts me, and they're referring to Caliban, and Prospero says, "This thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine." And on one hand, he's saying, "Yeah, okay, this is a member of my household staff. I'm sorry about that." But on the other, I think that line has resonance. I think that's okay. Yeah, there's a bit of him in me,
Yeah.
and it's almost like a Freudian ego, superego, and id kind of thing, And of course, science fiction fans will know that the ultimate expression of that idea of these characters being part of Prospero is the 1950s movie Forbidden Planet, in which there is a Prospero-like character played by Walter Pidgeon, and there is an entity which I guess corresponds to Caliban, called the beast from the id. And it's invisible, and it emerges only when when, the pigeon character, whose name I've forgotten, is asleep. And it is actually that character's id who goes on the murderous rampage.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's probably going a little further than Shakespeare intended. But as always with Shakespeare, one doesn't want to be always too literal in how you see these characters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I find it interesting. Like he like you're saying, he keeps doing this, like looking deeper and deeper and deeper, and it depends on which production you see, how deep you're going to go. Like in The Taming of the Shrew, I mean, this is about a man trying to dominate a woman, but why is this woman the way she is? Well, there was only one. I've seen Taming of the Shrew probably 10 times in different areas, but Stratford brought up a point right at the very beginning that she has a club foot.
Oh, yeah,
And
that was
and
sort of folded it, I think. Yeah.
yeah, and back in the day, when somebody was deformed like that, they were an outcast. They were made fun of. People spit on them and did all these terrible things to them. And so, of course, she comes into her prime and she's as bitter can be. And
Yeah.
it puts a whole different look on how she was treated and how that man tried to control her.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd forgotten about that. I think, as I recall, that choice, as I say, it was Irene Poole who played the part, and I don't know if it was her choice or the director's or what, but there is a line somewhere in the play, and I can't recall what the line actually is, but one of those, I think it's probably in their first meeting, and Petruchio's, he starts his game by sort of praising Kate for all the things that she manifestly isn't, like her sweet nature and so on. But he also says, "Oh, I don't get it. Why does everyone say Kate limps?" Or whatever it is he says. But
Yeah.
there's something to that effect in the play, and I just don't remember it off the top of my head. And so I think I guess they thought, oh, what if she actually did limp? And
Yeah.
yeah, that could be an explanation. Of course, that's a choice that's sort of got a little bit of a prompt in the script, but that isn't necessarily,
Yeah.
literal.
But it sure
But
puts a different slant on it.
it does. What we do know, of course, is that Kate is a woman in that society where women kind of get traded off to the highest bidder, as it were. And of course, she also has the well, supposedly, I guess, younger and prettier sister or whatever it is, Bianca. And there is clearly some resentment. Everyone wants Bianca. Bianca's got, what is it, 3 suitors in the play? I can't.
Yeah.
And Kate is kind of the spinster. So, Bianca is the prom queen, and Kate isn't. So there's that. And also, Bianca's, well, she's got her own kind of headstrong qualities, I guess, but basically she's daddy's girl, and Kate clearly is not the kind of woman who wants to be just doing what daddy wants.
Yeah.
So she's stronger. And she reacts by acting in I'm trying to find the word, a difficult way. She doesn't follow the social norms. And she takes that, I would say, my view of the play is that she takes that too far. It's understandable. Again, it's understandable. See it through her eyes and you get it. But it actually makes her more shrewish, if you like, than she needs to be.
Yeah.
And I think what Petruchio does is, regardless of what his motives may be, but I think what he does is basically give her a taste of her own medicine. He says, okay, you want to be like that? Here's what it feels like on the receiving end. And I mean, again, it depends how Kate is played, but I do remember Richard Monette's famous production. Goldie Semple was was Kate, and Kim Horseman, I think, was Bianca. It's this wonderful scene where Kate has Bianca tied into a chair, and she produces Bianca's teddy bear. And slowly and deliberately in front of Bianca's sobbing eyes dismembers the teddy bear. And, I mean, that was a legendary production, actually. And but I mean, it was that, Kate has circumstances have led Kate down a certain path, and she's become hardened into a certain mindset. And Trujillo, let's face it, is kind of looking for someone fairly well off to marry. He comes to wive it wealthily in Padua, as he says. But I think there is an immediate physical attraction between them both. And so I think he says, oh, yeah, okay, I get it both. I get money and I get hot stuff. So let's make her a bit more tractable. And so he kind of does the nasty number that she's been accustomed to be doing, and it kind of takes her by surprise. I mean, I say all that. I mean, frankly, I find Shrew a harder play to swallow than Merchant, because I find it easier to see the implicit critique that Shakespeare's doing in Merchant. It's harder for me to see the critique in Shrew. I do always feel a little uncomfortable in Shrew. I don't think Shakespeare's endorsing that treatment of women, but
it makes you uncomfortable.
It makes me uncomfortable, and maybe it's an earlier play, so maybe just hadn't quite mastered that thing of really thinking yourself into the other person's viewpoint. One might want to get a little more sense what the world is like from Kate's viewpoint. And I mean, obviously Shakespeare does get into female viewpoints much more richly in his later plays, but
I always find him interesting. A lot of the women, they go into nunneries, or they're like Kate and they're forced into marriage. But some of them, he's just brutal to them. Like I forget the name of the play. Oh my God, and I can see it. Her hands get cut off. She's raped, her hands get cut off.
Titus Andronicus.
And you're going, okay, so what does he really think about women? Like, what is society thinking about women if he can write all these different poor women being so tortured?
Well, I mean, Titus Andronicus was, it was an early play, by early tragedy, I guess this first real tragedy, and it tied into the Elizabethan love of, well, it was Shakespeare's equivalent of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's like, whoa, oh, we've seen horror films before, but this is whoa. And I mean, obviously, it's quite beyond it's totally implausible to imagine that Shakespeare was kind of rubbing his hands with glee in depicting this treatment of women. He was depicting, he's writing a revenge tragedy, and revenge tragedy, of course, was the great genre that took off, and everyone was keen on it. To use another modern analogy, the revenge tragedy was the John Wick play of it, equivalent to that character that Keanu Reeves plays, who, somebody kills his dog and then he spends, 5 or 6 movies shooting people in the head. So, I mean, it's a revenge tragedy. So the villains in the piece commit this appalling atrocity on Lavinia, tear out her tongue, they cut off her hands. but they get their revenge, and I don't think John Wick could have done any better. If I'm remembering the character's name, it is John, isn't it? Anyway,
yeah, it's John Wick.
the rapists, the mutilators, end up getting baked in a pie or pies and served up to their unsuspecting mother. So, and it's just horror all the way. But there was a taste for that. I mean, you got to remember again, I said at the top of this about you can't think yourself into an Elizabethan sensibility.
Right.
So most theater goers today don't usually choose between, oh, shall we go see a play? Shall we go see a movie? Or shall we go see a chained bear being set upon by dogs? Or hey, there's a hanging, drawing, and quartering coming up next Saturday. We could go to that. There was a presence of sickening violence in the lives of Shakespeare's audience that, we get only from television, from the news or from movies, but they could enjoy it in real life. So that sets them apart from us too. So again, what was Shakespeare doing in that play? We can see what he's doing from our point of view. We're not quite sure what he was doing from an Elizabethan point of view. Interestingly, so you mentioned Titus Andronicus, and in that play, there is a character called Aaron, who is Shakespeare's other Moorish character. So in other words, Aaron is black. And Aaron is pretty much a redeemable villain. And at the end of the play, his villainy is punished. He's going to be sort of buried up to his neck and left to starve to death. And he's asked, I think he's asked if he repents, and he says, oh yeah. If I repent anything, it's any good deed that I ever did.
So I mean, that line.
This is the guy. This is the guy who just sort of, and then by complete contrast, you get the other, of course, and more famous Moorish character in Shakespeare was Othello.
Yeah.
And yes, Othello ends up murdering his wife, which is, not good. But he is tricked into doing that by the evil character, who is in this case Iago, who is usually white. And what's interesting here is that, Othello is not, this is hard to say, but I don't actually think Othello is a play about race. I mean, some people who don't know the play may see it that way, but I really don't think it is. Othello is black, yes. And there are people in the play, Brabantio being the obvious one, Desdemona's father, who used that as an insult. He says, I don't know if it's him who says this, but an old black ram is how it's Iago, I think, tells Brabantio that an old black ram is tupping your ewe. And so Brabantio is all sort of, steamed up. But when he complains to the court that his daughter Desdemona has eloped with a black man and therefore must have been bewitched, because why would a white girl elope with a black man if she wasn't bewitched? And the Duke and everyone else in the court says, "Oh, get a life! Come on, be real." Because in this society, Othello, as opposed to Shylock, Othello is honored and relied on, and he's the guy they turn to save the country, from its enemies. And he never really, he doesn't deviate from that, except that he gets more and more under the spell of Iago's lies, fake news, disinformation.
Oh, don't we know about that now?
Yeah, don't we though? And gets duped into committing this appalling act on the wholly innocent Desdemona, and then realizing what he's done, does, I guess, the honorable thing and kills himself. So yeah, it's interesting. I again, Shakespeare takes you into the mind of both Othello and Iago. And it's also, I think, a mistake to think that Iago's motivation is racial hatred. He does cite that at one point, but he also cites other motives. Famously, we're not quite sure why Iago does what he does. And he says to the audience, well, he suspects that Othello has been having a fling with his Iago's wife. Not true, but Iago says that. He also feels slighted that he's been passed over for promotion. Okay, fair enough. But really, we're not quite sure that Iago himself knows why he does what he does. And it's not just that he's a racist. This is not as simple as that. This is not, he's the grand dragon or whatever they are of the KKK. He's just a guy who's got a desperate chip on his shoulder and a malcontent, and we don't quite know why, and he doesn't quite know why. And even at the very end, when he's said he's basically going to be subjected to a painful execution, and he says, yeah, and they ask him if he's got anything to say, and says no, because I don't think he knows what to say.
Yeah. So one last question before I let you go, because I can sit here and talk to you for hours about this. I'm if I lived in Stratford, we'd be having coffee at least once a week, and I'd be just picking your brain. A lot of people say Shakespeare is not relevant anymore. Anymore, like they don't understand why people are still putting on Shakespeare's plays. I know my opinion. I totally disagree with that. I think with each production, it evolves into what today's society is about. What do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm always a little cautious with the oft-cited claim that Shakespeare is universal. I think most of us, perhaps, certainly in this culture, can understand Shakespeare. And Shakespeare translates into other cultures very well, but I'm not convinced that every single person on the planet, if they got to see a Shakespeare play done well, would necessarily think, oh, this is for me. I think there's always going to be an audience for a certain kind of art, and there's going to be an audience for whom that certain kind of art may not mean much. I mean, that's just me. Maybe I'm just being skeptical. But that said, I do think that these plays are so rich and varied, and they show such insight into elements of humanity that probably are universal. I mean, not, so I mean, Shakespeare was writing in a culture where, women didn't have the kind of rights women have today. He was writing in a culture where Jewish people or Black people weren't all that common and, probably seen as exotic and blah, blah, blah. He was writing in a culture where colonizing other countries seemed like a perfectly right and fine thing to do. And so not everyone's going to respond in the same way to that, but he also delved into what it felt like to be in love. He delved into what it felt like to feel hatred. He delved into areas of human experience that we hope most of us never have, like what it feels like to be a murderer. And that is what makes him fascinating, because it's not the exploration of the social issues, if you want to call them that makes him relevant, because those social issues, they change, there are variations, but there are certain things that are always there in human beings. And I think that the potential is always there in any Shakespeare play to resonate with whichever moment we happen to be living in today. And that resonance changes. I mean, obvious example, right? The 1945 Laurence Olivier film of Henry V, which they cut out all the nasty bits about Henry's war crimes, etc., etc. And, because it's the Second World War is coming to a close, and it's this brilliant propaganda piece. And so that film had that meaning for people in that society at that time. Now we're probably more likely to see Henry as a deeply ambiguous, if not outright nasty character, because of the things he does, and the threats he makes, which we pretty sure he would carry out. So, the social issues, the role of women, the attitude to other ethnicities, to other cultures, other classes, if you like, as well. All of that is kind of a bit fluid and will mean different things to people at different times. But, when you talk about feeling grief, when you talk about being desperately in love, when you talk about feeling the need for revenge and how do you balance that against justice, I think those are things that we always will find something in. So, different plays will appeal more at different times in history, but I think there will, as long as human beings stay much as they are,
we don't seem to be changing, do we?
we will find, well, yes, here we are into the 21st century after 70 years of European peace, thinking we've moved on. The end of history. Remember the end of history?
Yes.
And here we are with wars right, left, and center, and every prospect of, dictatorship arising in our closest friend. I mean, and don't even let me go there. It's frightening, and you do realize that we're never ever actually going to transform ourselves. I don't think the best we can do is to try to gain more insight into ourselves and into other people, and I think that's what Shakespeare does for us.
Oh, thank you, David, for coming on and talking. It's always such a great pleasure to listen to you because you have so much insight and intelligence. It's just incredible to me. Hopefully you'll come on the show again. And
well, I probably said all I have to say, but hey, yeah.
There's plenty to talk about. But thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure listening to you.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
What time will it be when war is no more? When bullets are melted and the warships moor.
This podcast is brought to you by Unbreakable Bindings Publishing Company. Executive produced by Lori Baldassi, produced by Ryan Richardson, hosted by Pam Goldstein.